In this lesson, we're going to take a look at a book by Cory called The Reactionary Mind. In this book, he goes back through history and he tries to find out what are the common elements of the conservative movements. And what he'll conclude is that conservative movements often throughout history arise in reaction to democratic, progressive, social movements. And so hence the title reactionary, but the mind part here is that this is not just an emotional response, that conservatism has an intellectual tradition. And so there will be arguments and justifications for the resistance to democratic movements throughout history. So let's take a look. So remember this diagram here just showing income inequality, but now we're going to use this just to symbolically represent any kind of inequalities in society, status inequalities or gender inequalities or economic inequalities or whatever. So here we see a timeline. So Cory he goes all the way back to the French Revolution, but if we just pick up with American history, we can think back to the 1860s and before, where there was an abolition movement, of course, gaining speed to abolish slavery. In the early 1920s, then, the women's suffrage movement and labor movements. And then, of course, in the 60s, civil rights movements. And today, we could say the gay rights movements. So Robin is going to argue that these are these social movements and that conservatism is a reaction against these types of movements. So if we think about some of the actual interactions, take the slave owner and the slave. Obviously, the slave owner is in a position of power over the slave, right? But so also, in the past, men had positions of power and privilege over women, right? Of course, in the economic sphere, the business owner has power over the worker. And so throughout history, then, we can see some of these movements as a kind of challenge to the hierarchy of power and status, right? So the abolition movement is going to challenge the power of the slave owner, right? The women's suffrage movement is going to challenge the privilege that men had to vote and women didn't. The workers are going to challenge the decisions by business and so on. They're going to organize into labor unions, right? And today, with the gay rights movement, homosexuals are going to challenge the traditional notions of family and so on. So Robin is going to call these movements of emancipation. So taking that concept that it's usually applied towards the slave situation in America and broadening that to include emancipating women, giving them a vote, emancipating labor, giving them more power in the factories and workplaces, and emancipating gays to empower them in contemporary times. So for Robin, then, when all these movements were happening, what you saw at the time and continuing to this day is a conservative reaction to these movements. So while these movements in history have often tried to assert political power in the political sphere, Robin thinks that ultimately the challenge is in the private domain of power. So all of these democratic movements were challenging private power, for example, in the field, right? So the plantation owners are going to be losing the right to own slaves, but that was a very intimate relationship on the plantation. And so the abolition movement is going to take something away from the plantation owners that affected them personally, privately, on their plantations. In the home, men are going to lose power in the public sphere, right? By giving up, or by women having the vote, that's going to dilute their power to decide issues in the political sphere. But of course, they're going to try to preserve the traditional gender roles in the home, right, that privilege men. So here's an example where women achieved public power, right, with the right to vote. But Robin is going to argue men still tried to hang on to the private power in the home through the differences in the gender roles, for example, and of course through privileged access to positions, economic job positions, and so on, that women only slowly began to have more access to. In the factory, then, the business owners, they were losing the right to set hours and wages and working conditions. But in the factory, that's a private relationship between the owners and the workers. So in all three, Robin argues what really is the sensitive issue for the conservative mind is this loss of power in the private sphere. And the fact that it's a loss is significant too, because then that's going to help conservatives garner support from others, because they can speak about a loss, and that is something that resonates with many people. We often have to endure losses in our own lives. So in general then, conservatism gives an intellectual justification for the social hierarchies. And when those hierarchies are challenged, conservatism is given new energy and new force, and it doesn't just resist mindlessly, but it comes up with arguments for why it is beneficial for society to retain some of these inequalities in power and status.